Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Mo Casey's Accountability webinar. We are going to be recording this session today, as well as sending out a PDF copy of the slides for your reference. So those will be coming your way. Thank you again for registering and joining us for today's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Thomas to kick us off.
Thank you, Monica. I'm Alicia Thomas, and Terry Fauché and Monica Zdrojeski and I are the accountability team for Mo Casey and Associates, and we're joined today also by Dr. Buck Gilcrease. And we're pleased to be with you this afternoon. As Monica said, we'll share the PDF, we'll share the recording, and also we'll pause along the way to answer questions that you might enter into the chat. We'll even have an opportunity during the presentation for you to share some ideas in the chat. So let's get started. We want to begin really with some virtual applause for all of you and all of the efforts and ingenuity and energy you have put into beginning these first few beginning weeks of school. We're past actually just the very beginning, long past it now. But kudos to you for all the effort to help kids be successful. If you have questions at the end of, or just want more information on some topics, we are going to have office hours at the end of this presentation. We'll have a session on assessments. We'll have a session on accountability and the 87th legislative session, and one on remote instruction. And all of those details will be our last slide at the end of that presentation. So here are the key topics for today. There are 5. We're going to look at the state of remote learning, the state of the state in Texas. We're going to do assessment updates and resources. Terry Fauché is going to look into her crystal ball and predict some things about the future of accountability in Texas. Monica's going to share some guidance about remote instruction, and we're going to do a quick look ahead to the 87th legislature. So let's think about where we've been and where we're headed. In his book, Leadership on the Line, Ron Heifetz says there are really two kinds of problems. One is technical problem, the kind of problem you can solve with information you already have, knowledge you already know, what you have in your head, right? And then there are adaptive challenges, the kind of challenges that take new learning, new patterns of behavior, new ways of doing business. Well, we feel like in Texas, all educators have had a crash course in adaptation for the last 6 months. This mission of bringing all kids to academic success, to career, college, and military readiness is so important. It has driven all the adaptation, all of the changes needed to meet kids virtually and now in person in some classrooms. So we know your adaptation muscles have been very flexed. You're getting pretty strong right now. Let's look at Texas. Who are we? We're a big state. A lot of differences, a lot of different regions. But let's look for a minute at a Texas selfie of who we are collectively. In the 2019 school year, there were almost 5.5 million students enrolled in Texas public schools. And in the state, there are 1,201 school districts. And in those districts, nearly 9,000 school campuses, 8,838. That includes 179 open enrollment charter schools. Out of those 1,201 districts, 1,008 of them, or 84%, they enroll fewer than 5,000 students. Every student counts in the Texas accountability system, but depending on the size of your school district, one student's impact varies. For example, in a large district such as Houston ISD, one student's assessment may count for as little as 0.3% of the overall rating. By contrast, in a smaller district, one student's assessment may count for as much as 3% of the overall rating. Now, where are we right now in terms of the COVID slide? This is a slide shared by the commissioner this summer. We know this is real and this is what we're dealing with. Leadership has always been important, never more important than now. We have a clear mandate for our work. This data was shared by TEA. It's from an online math coursework system. From February to June, there was decreased progress for all students. All students showed decline, but kids in poverty showed the steepest decline. And we know that there are long-term consequences for this kind of decline, long-term consequences for kids we really care about if their achievement goals are not realized. And these kinds of learning losses can have an impact on their lifetime earning power, which is why we as adults persevere to figure this out for them. Next slide is a huge piece of the concern. This is a quote from Larry Irving, who spoke on September 2nd at the Trib Fest, right? And he said, in talking about the digital divide, in talking about technology, he said, what's gone from an inconvenience, maybe, and a problem has gone to your life has changed dramatically if you're not connected. A bipartisan group of 88 state lawmakers said in a letter to the governor that a statewide broadband plan is well overdue. And 6 superintendents wrote in an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News, the internet is as vital to our collective well-being as electricity has been for the past 100 years, right? Why is this important? Because with teaching virtually, the report that came out from TEA in June said 600,000 kids did not complete assignments in the spring and did not respond to teacher outreach until the end of May, right? And of those kids, of those 600,000 Texas public school students, there were higher percentages of low-income Black and Hispanic students who disengaged, did not complete assignments, or were not responsive to their teachers. About 15.5% of educationally disadvantaged students were not fully engaged during the school closures, compared to 5% of higher income students. Why is that really important? Because the majority of Texas public school students are Hispanic and qualify as low income. Let's look at the state of Texas. Let's look at 2 factors, really: technology and attendance, or student engagement. It's complicated, right? But according to the NWEA, they predict a greater learning loss for minority and low-income students with less access to technology, and for families more affected by the economic downturn. Roughly 20% of students nationwide didn't have access to the technology they needed for remote learning. 20 to 24% of students did not have reliable access to the internet in 2019. And as you can see, Terry has created this map and broken it down by county with color-coded according to broadband availability. Terry, will you take us a little deeper into this data?
Sure, Alicia. You could see on that previous slide that there were some dark blue areas which all seem to kind of fit with a lot of our more urban areas in Texas. But in those small rural areas, that's where you can see that broadband is simply not as easily accessible as it is in the larger urban areas. So we decided we wanted to take a look at what that would look like if we were to take school districts and look at their broadband availability as compared to their economically disadvantaged enrollment. So that's what we did on the next slide. Again, this is broadband availability. We got this particular data from the American Community Survey, which is part of the census data that's updated every year. This comes from, I believe, January of 2019, American Community Survey data. And then this is our economically disadvantaged enrollment for the 1920 school year. So when we did this, we put those households that are in those particular districts that have no internet access, that's our y-axis going up and down there. And then going across the page, we have the percent of economically disadvantaged enrollment. Now, the size of the dot kind of gives you an idea of how big the school district is. And you'll remember that Alicia said that many of our school districts have less than 10,000 students in them. So there's a lot of very small black, orange, and gray dots. And then you could see those big dots right there and sort of coming across the page as well. So that doesn't really tell us much of anything. This looks just kind of like just a smattering of dots. It doesn't really give us any indication that there's any kind of correlation between broadband access and economically disadvantaged enrollment. But we decided to look a little bit deeper. And so on the next slide, we took out all of those large school districts and looked at simply the ones that have less than 10,000 students. And again, we don't really see any particular pattern. And we kind of feel that this has a lot more to do with whether or not, we've gotten broadband out to these outlying areas, whether or not that cable, that fiber optic cable has been laid in these particular areas. So that just has to do with whether or not it has been basically economically incentivized for some of our broadband providers to actually lay fiber optic cable out to these areas. But let's look at it when we look at districts that are 10,000 or greater. It's interesting because now we start to see a pattern, don't we? So where broadband is available, there's still pockets within those areas where it does seem to correlate with poverty. And you'll notice that I had put the R squared value on the previous slide as just 0.2, so there really wasn't any correlation. But now when we look at this one, we see a R squared value of almost 0.7. That's a huge correlation between broadband access and economically disadvantaged enrollment.
Okay, let's think about attendance, right? In this current situation. So attendance can be also a complexifier. It's a predictor of student success for grade level reading, and it can be a precursor to for dropout prevention, to really look at that. We know with asynchronous and with synchronous, the key is engaging lessons, and teaching strategies can be motivating for students. It's still hard for them to be engaged for a whole 5 to 6 hours virtually during the day, particularly for those little guys, those first graders learning how to read, for example. And then we know that addressing attendance in a virtual environment is also more challenging to think about sick days and issues such as suspension. And it just increases the need for districts and schools to work with community organizations to really customize for students. We want to shout out all those districts within your community, all those organizations within your community who are partnering with you to meet kids' unique challenges. Organizations such as Communities and Schools, a City Year, food banks across the state, healthcare organizations, all needing to meet kids' unique challenges. This is really, it's another layer to instruction, another layer to the challenge teachers have of really building classroom community and student engagement. So drilling down a little bit more on the digital divide, just as our English language learners have to develop academic language, so do our students have to develop the ability to use the technology, just pushing out, as many of you have done in such a fantastic way, getting the devices out there, getting the Wi-Fi connections out there. But we know that's one piece. The digital divide, there's the definition, the percent of households in your community with no internet access. But we know that the equity of access doesn't eliminate the divide. It's how can you use it? How can you engage? And again, we know about over 10 to 11% of kids did not engage in the spring. Let's look at the next one. So one way to think about that we found helpful in thinking about the educational digital divide is what's called the whole field model, a step process, right, for thinking about how to work within your community, because you will have a range within your district as well, a range within schools perhaps. To think about digital access. First, technology for teaching and learning, critically important to push that out, but no one size fits all. Next, we've tended to think about technology in terms of the haves and the have-nots. That's the first level, right? Who has access, who does not have access. But then there's really a second level that goes a little deeper. Who can use the technology and who cannot. And for chief academic officers, for all of educators at the central office, for all of the principals, and for people that work to support campuses, there are big implications for student achievement here. There are implications for district decisions around training, around updates, around technology maintenance, about staff to support all of that, and about professional development. How do we customize and differentiate across the district, across the campus for professional development for teachers so that they can provide that same support for the young people they serve. So let's think about your experience, right? How would you compare what it was like leading remote instruction last spring to where we are now in the fall of 2020? You can use the chat to share your district story and insights you may have gained. We'll give you about 30 seconds to enter into the chat any insight or learning that you've acquired during this time. Okay, you can keep entering as we continue to go on, and we'll look at some of those answers as we go through.
But if I can chime in, Dr. Thomas, we've had a couple come in that I think we'd like to highlight. Just hearing that, you know, in the spring of last school year, it was a lot of, you know, getting out devices very quickly, and everything just happened very quickly and without a lot of time for intentional planning and design. And so what we're hearing from folks, and for chiming in on the chat, and please continue to do so, but we've heard that districts have been able to more intentionally craft plans with the engagement of multiple stakeholders rather than quickly cobbling together something. We've heard that there has been more time to prepare teachers and campus leaders, which has allowed them to step up the level of rigor with online learning and provide more student engagement opportunities. And so seeing what we saw about the digital divide, we know that that is so important to really intentionally engage students so that they will be participating. There is the acknowledgement that a lot of technical support is needed for families as well as bilingual support. We've heard about the need to incorporate even more so socio-emotional learning, just knowing the context of what's going on. And again, just hearing that there has been more time to intentionally plan and be less reactionary. Of course, we know that you all have really, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, exercise the muscle even more so of being flexible and adaptable, as there are still so many unknowns. And so thank you all for chiming in with the chat. And we hope that you'll join in office hours later this afternoon to have more time to engage with one another and speak more about your district story. All right, Dr. Thomas.
Great, because a lot has been learned in it, and it is helpful to share all of that. Mike Villarreal, a former state representative, was quoted in the San Antonio Express News. We felt like he really kind of summed up why this work is so important. And he said, our public schools serve a vital and profound democratic purpose. They are no less critical to our democracy than the voting booth. A new generation of leaders, scientists, inventors, artists, and more will trace their love of learning and humanity back to a teacher who saw their unlimited potential. Mike has a special research position right now at the University of Texas at San Antonio, but what brings him a great deal of insight is he was a former state representative and member of the House Pub Ed Committee. So a lot of info there that informs his work. All right, Terry, are you gonna, let's see, Monica first.
Yes. So next up, we'll be giving a quick update on some assessment resources. So of course, since our last TSPN webinar, we have heard from Governor Greg Abbott that he waived the grade promotion requirement related to the STAAR test for grades 5 and 8. And so the implications of this for your work is that there will only be one administration of STAAR grades 5 and 8 math and reading assessments for the 2020-2021 school year. And that administration will coincide in May with the other grades 3 through 8 assessments. And so key here is that districts will have local discretion on whether these students should advance to the next grade level, just as you would with your students in grades 3, 4, 6, and 7. And these decisions should be based off of your local criteria that reflects students' academic achievement and mastery of subject matter. And it should really include whatever relevant information you are able to gather. And so I think the importance of holding great documentation, even in this virtual setting, so that there can be clear and honest communication with parents up front, since there won't be this normal stopgate that we have with the grades 5 and 8 STAAR administration. Districts will still be responsible for providing accelerated instruction and supports for students that failed to perform satisfactorily on STAAR. And furthermore, although students in grades 5 and 8 will not be retained solely on the basis of STAAR results, school districts and charter schools will remain accountable for student performance. And that is something that we have heard really clearly across the board from Commissioner Morath, that at this point in time, the STAAR assessment is intended to go on as planned in the spring of 2021. And the traditional A through F rating system is expected to remain in place. And so that is something that we have very consistently heard, despite I know significant feedback from districts and from other lawmakers who are worried about the context of this school year. So that will be something that Terry will preview for us here shortly. But before we move on to that, we wanted to quickly go over some assessment resources that you have at your disposal. So the first one we wanted to highlight is the optional STAAR beginning of year assessment that has been stood up by TEA. And so this is a full-length STAAR exam, and it will need to be administered to the previous grade level completed. So for your incoming 4th graders, you will want to administer the 3rd grade STAAR. For high school students moving to the next course in their sequence, districts may find value in administering the beginning of year assessment for the course they completed during the 1920 school year. For example, many districts offer geometry after Algebra 1. And so students enrolled in geometry for the 2020-2021 school year may be administered the Algebra 1 BOY assessment in early fall of 2020. Districts may also want to consider administering the beginning of the year assessments to students who did not successfully complete a course in the 1920 school year and are repeating the course in fall of 2020. And we really see the value here as being able to use this as a diagnostic to be able to see how the COVID slide affected your students and be able to gauge. And so that's where we use these little kind of heartbeat monitors, because the idea is to really have your pulse on student performance throughout the course of this school year. TEA has gone ahead and extended the registration window in response to school district request. So you are able to register students through October 9th, and you're able to administer these assessments through October 16th. Another thing to note here is that parents do have the ability to administer these at home if they so choose. So that is something to keep in mind. The other piece here that we wanted to highlight is around the HB3 board goals. So we know that it is a requirement under House Bill 3 that the board sets a number of goals and progress measures. And that deadline for the goal setting has actually been extended yet again through January 31st of 2021. And they can be incorporated in the 2020-2021 district and campus improvement plans for board adoption during this school year, once the goals and progress measures are approved by the board. So this, as you recall, is a second extension to the previous deadline. And so the reason we wanted to highlight that extension here is because of the fact that districts did not have data from STAAR from last school year in order to set baseline data. And so we see these beginning of the year assessments as the ability to have that baseline data and be able to drive your district goals and progress measures by utilizing the data gained through the optional STAAR beginning of year assessments. The next assessment resource to highlight are the interim assessments. These are not, as all of you on the call know, these are not new. TEA has offered these previously. There are 2 testing windows in the fall and the spring. These are what we're calling medium-sized exams. They are not the full-length STAAR exam, but give a snapshot or a random sampling of STAAR questions that cover TEKs that need to be covered throughout the school year. And the interim assessment you would be administering, if you have 4th grade students, you would be administering that 4th grade interim assessment there. They do have these available for all grades and subjects except writing, but you will need to check the testing windows to see at what point in time the different tests are offered. And there is a predictive element for spring of 2021 success. So the dates are there as well in terms of the registration windows. And then finally, this is a new resource, the Texas Formative Assessment Resource. So this is one that allows you to keep your pulse, do those pulse checks more regularly as you all see fit. I do want to again emphasize that all 3 of these options are optional. And they are intended to serve as resources for school districts to utilize as they see fit. So the new TFAR tool can be used to create and deliver assessments that are aligned and connected with existing instructional plans, lessons, and curriculum. And so that resource can be used to help create formative class assessments as part of a broader student progress monitoring system. So mini quizzes, weekly quizzes, monthly assessments, warm-up, exit tickets. And so this new and free tool will consist of an item bank that is aligned to the TEKs. And it's designed to support teachers in gaining real-time formative feedback on student learning as instruction occurs. And so this resource is intended to be used as part of either on-campus or virtual instruction, and it is intended to supplement and support existing district resources and formative assessment practices. And so TFAR became available starting August 31st of 2020. Initially, the item bank will contain STAAR released items, but over time, they do intend to continue to add additional items. Teachers will have the ability to create their own TEKS aligned items to administer within the platform. And so the agency did hold a webinar back in August on this, and the recording is available on the Texas Formative Assessment Resource webpage.
Okay. Thank you, Monica. So now we're going to talk about the future of accountability. And of course, I think that's what everybody wants to know. First off, though, what we need to know is where we are right now. And so what was 2020 accountability? It actually happened. It is now complete. We got our ratings on August 15th, as was required by law. All schools and districts were rated as not rated, declared state of disaster. The 2021-22 PEG list is the same as last year, and it was also released on August 14th. And all schools that were in various stages of school improvement for the 1920 school year will continue with all sanctions and interventions that were previously in place. They'll continue that during the 2021 school year. All the data that's going to be coming available for the 1920 school year, as it becomes available, it will be ready to view in TEA's HTML version of the taper. That will include CCMR data. I know a lot of you have seen a bunch of your CCMR data coming out on the secure portal. And so as that data becomes publicly available, you'll see it in taper. The design of the paper taper, as TEA refers to the one that we traditionally have gotten that's in PDF form, is uncertain because we don't have 2020 STAAR, so it will probably look a little different. It might perhaps look a little bit like the 2012 taper did when we didn't really have any of the new STAAR exam data. So what do we know about what's going to happen? TEA has said that they intend to rely on any kind of recommendations they get from their two advisory committees, the Accountability Technical Advisory Committee and the Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. Some of you may serve on those committees, but surely there are people in your particular region of the state that also serve on those committees. So if you know those people, or you are one of those people, you're encouraged to go ahead and voice all of the concerns that you hear that's about to follow here to those people that are on the committee. So let's look at the ATAC and the APAC committee. They actually met this past July and started the work on 2021 accountability. They met on July 20th and 21st to begin those discussions. And the first thing they did was they took a poll of all of their members to find out what it was that concerned them the most about 2021 accountability. And so what we'd like to do is give you that very same poll right now. So if we could, Monica, let's see what we can do here. Yes, there it is. So if you would, just put down what your biggest concern is right now about 2021 accountability. And I'm going to give you a few minutes. We'll watch as it goes through there. But we have things like instructional loss, academic growth, the ratings. What do we do about school improvement, the CCMR data, graduation rates, and English learner proficiency. All right. Are we almost done there, Monica?
We are at 71% right now, so
All right, get your choices in.
give us a couple more seconds. Final choices.
Don't you wish it was this easy to vote for in November?
All right, we've got a couple more coming in. Give it about 5 more seconds. All right, going once, going twice. I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll out so we can see our results. Oh, got a couple more.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
So it looks like most of our people who are in on this webinar today are concerned about COVID instructional loss, followed very closely by academic growth. And the one that was the least picked was graduation rates. Thank you so much, Monica. That is great. So let's look at what ATAC and APAC's concerns were. And guess what? It was exactly the same as what you're worried about. Everything. They had a tie, actually, between instructional loss and academic growth. Followed by ratings. What do we do about school improvement, CCMR, and the graduation rates and English learner proficiency were in a tie. They did have a few other small things that they were concerned about, such as de-emphasizing high-stakes testing, focusing on diagnostic testing and interventions, resetting targets, and possible punishing of schools for lack of performance. So what did they look at during their July 20th and 21st meetings? Well, TEA went ahead and presented to them the results from that particular survey you just saw. They looked at potential 2021 accountability scenarios, USDE guidance, what other states are doing, commissioner updates, and then data requests using 2019 data. And so this has been really informative, and I think that y'all are going to get a real sense of where the committees are going once we look at it. So TEA presented 4 different potential approaches to how they might handle 2021 accountability. And the first option would be to keep everything exactly the same. Absolutely no changes. Now, the first thing you're probably thinking is, okay, well, we didn't have 2020 STAAR, so what are we going to do about growth since it uses the previous year? Well, they would use the closest data proxy they would have for growth. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit, but what we mean is some kind of placeholder, some kind of a substitute test, some kind of substitute indicator for that. But they would go ahead and use the existing calculations and performance expectations, and they would identify and exit campuses for school improvement the same way we always have. The second option would be to go ahead and modify the system a little bit, where they would keep the system the same, but they would just make slight modifications to it. So they would, let's say they would probably adjust some of the calculations and performance expectations given the challenges that we've had this year. And again, they would probably do some kind of changes to exiting and entering schools in the school improvement process because they're recognizing those challenges. Option 3 would be to create some type of a temporary system where they would totally revise maybe the weighting and the scaling. They would revise and replace some of the elements because we wouldn't have some of that data. And then we would use this data for 2021, but then we'd go back to the regular system in 2022. And then the final way that they would do it is to create some type of transitional system. If you'll recall, the commissioner had said we would keep all of the same targets and everything for the next 5 years. He wanted to have them all in place for 5 years, and we started in 2018. So 2023 was when we would normally be looking at new targets anyway. So perhaps we could use 2021 data to then start to benchmark for 2022 what our new system would look like, and we would implement a fully updated system in 2023. So those were the 4 options the TEA gave us. Some of the other things they looked at was the USDE guidance. What have we heard from the federal government? Well, the federal government has said it's too early to speculate on getting any more waivers for the 2021 school year. And at this point, it looks like they're very determined to go ahead and have federal accountability, which implies we will have state accountability. They are developing an addendum template for states to see what was the most impacted and whether or not it would be appropriate to modify their system or just temporarily change it. And the summer template release is available probably sometime late 2020. The change would apply for the 1 year. It would require public comment and a streamlined review process. U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos has already informed states not to count on getting the same waivers they got last year. Again, that's something that's very much, she's pretty adamant about. And she said, it is now our expectation that states will, in the interest of students, administer summative assessments during this school year consistent with the requirements of the law and following the guidance of local health officials. So she was pretty firm on that one. So what about what other states are doing? Well, some states plan to pursue that waiver again. Michigan, South Carolina, Georgia, you can see there. Most states are trying to model what data they have to determine which metrics are going to be the most effective and whether or not to include them. A few states are surveying stakeholders about the potential implications of issuing ratings at all. Another one is trying to layer social vulnerability index data with the federal designations to try to determine the impact of COVID-19. And some are using this time to completely rework their systems. There's going to be one more meeting of the state school officers, of which Commissioner Morath is a participant, and that will happen sometime this fall, and I'm sure we'll get more information about what other states might be doing. And then finally, what are the commissioner's thoughts about all of this? Where do we think he's going with this? He's saying we should continue to monitor the situation, and in the meantime, use as much data as we can to determine the best path forward. We won't make any decisions until the end of the calendar year, so that's December of 2020. And the targets may need to be flexible due to the unpredictable impact of these outcomes. Okay. So the next thing that they talked about, you may recall, I mentioned that they asked for 2019 data to model some things about it, and what data do we have that's available? So the first thing that these committees asked how does TELPAS participation differ from 19 to 20? Remember that in 2020, that the TELPAS window had basically just opened. And so you could see that we had greater or lesser success on some of these different tests than we had on others. Some of them we were almost done with, some of them we weren't even close to being done with. Okay. Some of the other data they asked about. They said, okay, how many campuses would have earned a lower closing the gaps domain grade if we had not had academic growth, which is something we won't have this year, and that's why they're kind of concerned about it. So 21% of campuses would have earned a lower closing the gaps domain grade without growth. Another thing, what about overall grades? About 16% would have been lower if they had not had academic growth to include. And in 2019, most districts performed the highest on student achievement domain or the school progress relative performance domains. Those were the two everybody did the best on. Okay. And then finally, if you had a low ECD rate, you probably performed highest on the student achievement domain. If you had a high economically disadvantaged enrollment rate, it was likely that your best area was probably the school progress Part B relative performance domain. All right. So what they did was they said, what if we had, what's the consistency rate if we did a 2-year progress measure instead of a 1-year progress measure? And a 2-year progress measure would, of course, take our 2019 data and go to 2021 data rather than 20 to 21. And so how they did this is they measured how we did in 2019 using our normal growth rate, and then they tried doing it using a 2-year rate to see how many kids would have still gotten either met or accelerated as far as their progress goes, okay? And here's what we found out. In math, the overall consistency rate ranged from 62 to 66% in grades 5 through 8. So basically 2/3 of the kids would have done pretty much the same, whether or not we used a 1-year rate or a 2-year rate to come up with a progress measure. And then in reading, it ranged from about 56% to 67%. So there was a little bit more variation, and a lot of that variation had to do with language, whether or not you were taking the Spanish or the English test. And we found that pretty interesting. So then finally, we started looking at some of the concerns that ATAC and APAC expressed, and I'm sure that y'all are thinking of the same thing. They're concerned about enrollment fluctuations. What about kids who they think they're going to have a pod this year, and then they decide that the pod idea is not really working for them? So kids enroll late this year, or they get concerned that there is an outbreak and then they unenroll. Or we have also problems with mobility rates. Mobility rates where schools may be moving, kids may be moving in different patterns than ordinarily. And in the mobility rates, you have kids that may decide to go to another district that's neighboring because they offer in-person learning rather than just virtual. Teacher shortages obviously are a huge concern. We're worried about the fact that we're having to make do with less. Some teachers have just simply left this year. And then, of course, the complex student needs goes without saying that we have got some serious issues when it comes to wondering what we're going to do about everything that's affecting our students, the social emotional, the academics, the learning loss, everything. So those were their general concerns. As far as assessment and accountability concerns, the variations in the data. This is not a normal year. These kids are not taking normal tests. They did not have that previous test. You've got 4th graders who did not take the 3rd grade test, so they're also going to be doing this for the first time. We're going to worry about COVID outbreaks. If we have more outbreaks, what are we going to do about that? Connectivity and staffing, we've talked about in the rural versus the urban settings. We've talked about increases in online testing. Some of these things will have to be actually done online. And we all know what happened when we went all online, first of all, with TELPAS, and then when with the accommodated tests for STAAR, there were a lot of outages. And then statewide, the technology and connectivity issues, again, that's still a problem. What do we do about remote proctoring if we have to offer the tests remotely? And finally, do we use it as an accountability versus a diagnostic tool? Some of the proposed suggestions that they came up with: use the data to inform instruction and performance, and don't do accountability for 2021. Perhaps we should go to more of a pass-fail system and do met standard or not met standard. Once the school year's underway, with the mobility patterns that are emerging, we might be able to determine what our continuously enrolled and non-continuously enrolled rates will look like and how they've been affected. We're looking at the possibility of lowering the participation rate. Remember, right now we have a 95% target for participation. They might lower that this year temporarily. And then, of course, use the 2021 data to set targets. That's what we were talking about in option 4. And then finally, improving methodology for exiting comprehensive support campuses. Okay. And the final thing they had was just some other items to note that came out in these meetings. Again, I mentioned already about the chief state school officers. We'll be able to hear more from them. We have the fact that no data is available for either participation or performance from the optional end of year assessment. and because districts weren't required to report those results. So we really don't know how well kids actually did on that test, and what changes the November election might have on what USDE is going to require. Other chief school officers who have been through transitions have said that most things are long-term. So even if there is a change in November, nothing would happen immediately. And finally, there was one little thing about military data. They're still trying to obtain military data from the Department of Defense. And TEA's current guidance for military enlistment is to only code students as military ready that have documentation of enlistment. We noticed this because it was a change from what they have been saying in their performance reporting communiques. And so we thought we better mention this because this is the only place we've actually seen this mentioned. So that's everything that happened for the July 20th and 21st meetings. They will have another meeting end of October, early November, and we'll be sharing with you everything that we learned from that one.
All right, thank you, Terry.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting to our final 10 minutes. And so our next point is very briefly, we're going to go through a couple of remote instruction guidance pieces. We know you all are already, weeks into implementation of your synchronous or asynchronous or hybrid plans. And so there were just a couple of things we wanted to go ahead and share and highlight. First, the agency, along with DISHES, the department, I actually can't remember the full acronym of DISHES, but the health services department here in the state have stood up this dashboard here. We know this is something that school districts have been required to report to the agency. Very specifically, it's cases for those districts that have transitioned back to in-person instruction. It's cases that are happening on campus. And so the dashboard is updated on Wednesdays. And so we know that as the transition period ends, I know of a couple of teachers in districts that are going back to some form of in-person starting today or next week. We know that there will be, a rolling start to in-person instruction over the course of October.
I got it.
So it will be interesting to monitor this dashboard and see where school districts are at in terms of the number of in-person cases, both at the student level and at the staff level. Next, we wanted to go over the submission timeline very quickly for asynchronous plans. So for districts that submitted their letter of intent for an asynchronous plan, should have received a link directly from TEA. That is where you submit your plan to. So this gives you the full timeline. LEAs do have until October 1st, which is coming up here quickly. And so that gives time for review, revisions, and approval by the 4th 6 weeks. The other key part here is that your plan will either be approved or you will be notified that you need to make revisions to the plan. We have heard varying reports from districts in terms of how much feedback is actually given back to districts. Again, you have another period of time by which to submit any revisions that were required. The key deadline we wanted to highlight here is when the grace period ends, because at the end of the 3rd 6 weeks reporting period, funding for asynchronous remote attendance will stop without an approved plan. And so we just encourage LEAs to continue to submit these as quickly as possible and make those revisions as well. As of Thursday's commissioner call, 314 plans have been approved. And so this is something that those numbers will be updated as these plans are approved over time. So I anticipate we'll continue to get weekly updates on that plan approval number. And the agency did mention, once you have submitted your plan, not to submit it again. This is the review process that's been shared. So the plan submitted, there's an initial screen. If your plan passes that initial screen, it then goes into a more intensive plan review. If the plan is not approved at that point in time, TEA will be requiring a resubmission, and then they provide some level of feedback and support and review at that point in time to ensure that there is an approved plan in place so that funding continues to flow through. So what we wanted to go ahead and do here, and I'm just going to actually turn it over to Alicia, but as we get into our final section of our presentation, we would like you all to chime in the chat with implementation challenges that you all have faced at the start of this school year, whether that be with remote instruction, the synchronous or asynchronous or hybrid models, Texas Home Learning 3.0, Schoology or your district selected learning management system, or transitioning to in-person. So as we continue on for the next 4 minutes, please feel free to chime in the chat with any implementation challenges that you all have been facing.
Thank you, Monica. So, you know, another great quote from the Trib Fest, Arnie Duncan, talking about the students right now, our kids. Could they be the next greatest generation? They are learning empathy, learning about sacrifice. This is a chance for them to learn by our examples and to have an impact for the next 40, 50, 60 years that might be extraordinary because they have been through this challenge. Looking on the bright side, right, of getting through this struggle and looking ahead for the good things that'll come out of it. Looking ahead to the November election. It'll be on November 3rd, and just a couple of key dates. Monday, October 5th, a week from today is the last day to register to vote. And then early voting will be from October 13th to Friday, October 30th for the early vote. And then have to have received by October 23rd, a request for a mail-in ballot. That's the last day that it could be received. And we know that the top of the ticket is certainly of interest to everybody, but we have to remember there are a lot of down ballot races too that could have an impact on public education in Texas. A lot of interest in all the races. Let's look ahead to the 87th legislature. It'll begin on Tuesday, January 12th, 2021. We think that bills will, after the election, those who won their races for the Texas House or for the Senate will begin pre-filing bills, and the regular session will be 140 days. It'll begin on the 12th. And just know that as a TSPN member, your legislative service will keep you up to date about all the school finance and school accountability legislation that will be discussed. Let's look at what we've looked at in the past 2 sessions. We know that there's a lot of discussion during the typical legislative session. This will be no different, no doubt. The legislature usually considers about 6,000 bills, but the education bills tracked by Moat Casey and Associates in both the 85th and the 86th session were a little over 1,000 bills in each session. And then of those 1,000 bills, between 11 and 12% of those bills passed. So just know debates will be held, laws will be passed. We'll keep you up to date as TSPN members. We're going to find out what it's like to legislate during a pandemic. We know there'll be a lot of plexiglass, right? There'll be a lot of shields, and we know the economic situation will be a major consideration. One thing that will happen in the Texas House is they will formally elect a new Speaker of the House on the first day of the regular session in January, and whoever takes the gavel at that time will help respond to incredible issues across the state right now, responding to the coronavirus pandemic, grappling with billions of dollars in shortfalls to the state budget, and undergoing a once-in-a-decade redistricting cycle. It'll be a very significant session, the 87th. So as we get into November, go through the elections, the bills start getting pre-filed, please don't hesitate to reach out to us for any questions, either at that time or any questions you may have or additional thoughts from this presentation today. Monica, will you go back to those office hours? We'll publicize those a little bit more. We'll be open if you have specific questions about your district, something you'd like to go a little more in depth into. From 2:30 to 3, we'll be focusing on assessments from 3:15 to 3:45 today, on accountability, the information Terry provided, and or the legislative session coming up. And we'll be available to discuss remote instruction today from 4 to 4:30. You can email Monica at that address right there, at mokecasey.com, Monica Zdrojeski at mokecasey.com, and we'd be glad to see you today, this afternoon, or at any time that we might be of help. Thanks so much for joining us today. Any closing remarks, Monica and Terry?
No, the only thing I did want to quickly add is if you had gone ahead and used the sign up to pre-register for the for our office hours, you should have received the Zoom link already in your inbox. But if you are now discovering that you'd like to join us this afternoon, please feel free to. And so I would just ask that you email me my email address. I'll leave that there on the screen. And then that way I'll be able to get the Zoom link out to you for the office hours. If you're not able to join us, I will quickly show all of our email addresses here. And again, we will be sending out the recording of this session as well as a PDF version of the slides for your reference. So those slides will contain all of our email addresses as well, because I'm going to go ahead and go back to our office hours just so that you can take a look and see if any of these work for your schedule. So again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's always great to be here with you all. And so we will go ahead and close there. Thanks again.
Take good care, everybody.
Thank you.